federal and state. And so we had some issues, very long compliance time. They were working 10 to 12 months a year, not a terribly enthusiastic and happy group just because of the churn that was going on with all of the returns. I had only been at Cardinal Health for about 3 months when 8 of the people in that group had left. 1 left Cardinal, the other 7 went to other roles within Cardinal. So we really had to find a solution. I had thought about an internship program like this for quite some time and had very good relations with both Brigham Young University and University of Georgia, neither of which are close to Cardinal Health. And so we started talking internally and putting together the the vision of this program. So as Tony mentioned, 3 years ago, we launched it with the first cohort of 12 students. The students came in, they received training ahead of time. We had them come to Cardinal Health for 2 weeks for some intensive training with us. Then it's about a 2-to-1 ratio, 2 students to 1 advisor in our team. And that advisor works very closely with the students. They help us put together all of the pro forma returns that go into our consolidated return. A few of them will actually stay on even during the fall and work with us and help prepare state tax returns and work on other projects as well. So it's been very successful. It's been great for the students, great for the schools, and obviously it's been a tremendous asset for us at Cardinal.
How much has this bottom line saved you from a budget standpoint on a percentage of what you were spending or dollar amount? Just a ballpark.
Several hundred thousand. I can't remember the exact numbers, but it's probably somewhere between 500,000 and $1 million, and closer to the $1 million mark.
Wow. Okay. All right, Shannon, let's open it up for any questions, follow up to this topic. Does anybody have any more questions they want to pose, or do you have any in the chat group, Shannon?
None in the chat group.
Okay. Open on the floor. Anybody want to inquire how this came about and whether or not there's the potential implement in their situation and what some of the issues were that Scott and Cardinal ran into?
Hi, this is Rita. I'm curious. Did you use the crew of interns only in the compliance area? Did you find any expanded roles or facilitating anything outside of the reporting function?
We've been expanding it into other parts of the tax department, and that's proved a little bit more difficult, but notwithstanding, there are still some very specific projects. For example, we had a few students who have been helping us with answering notices with states, responding to different things like that. We've had some other people that have helped us put together responses to IDRs and other controversy with state tax returns. A couple of them worked very extensively, and because of they're very tech savvy, so they worked on the R&D credit with us. So yeah, they have done other projects besides just the compliance with the federal and state returns.
Thanks.
Oh, hey, this is David Ware. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Doing all right, thanks. So, what are you using their the Masters of Accounting students? Is that what you're doing?
Actually, we're not. We're actually using sophomores that haven't even been accepted into the accounting program yet. Most of them have taken 2 or 3 accounting classes, but by the time we hire them and they are onboarded, they've completed roughly 120 hours of training with us, tax specific, and very specific to the roles and responsibilities that they'll have in our department.
Right. So these are sophomores that are looking to go into the master's program then.
That's correct. And I would say also, just by virtue of the way that it gets filtered down and many of the students kind of self-select out because of the requirements that we have, by the time we get down to the 25 or so that we're interviewing to get a cohort of 12, for the first 2 years, there hasn't been a single one of our students that hasn't been accepted into their respective school's accounting program.
Nice. Yeah, I was in the BYU program many years ago.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. How do you keep your data? Do you have any problems with data security with
No,
doing
we
this
just
all
worked
remote?
very closely with our IT group and our IT department to make sure that we had all of that covered. I mean, yeah, it wasn't like it was just a slam dunk, but we were able to work through all of the issues with them.
Okay, yeah, 'cause that would be one of my worries is you're sending out this data to somewhere you're not sure where they're accessing it from, and imagine the issues that might cause.
See, we didn't really view it any different than any employee. They actually are employees. We onboard them as employees. And so we didn't really see it as, any different than, any employee with a laptop working remotely. So we just use the same protocols that you do for any employee.
Gotcha. Okay. But they use their own technology?
Yes, they do. We have kind of a bring your own device policy here at Cardinal. So any associate or employee can use their own computer if you want. You just have to have the right type of software downloaded on it.
Gotcha. So that was a hurdle that you guys already had probably done through before. So.
That's right.
Okay. Very good. Thanks for the information.
Nope, no problem.
Scott, this is Tony. I was curious, after the couple times we've spoken, what is the biggest challenge you think after you've got it up and running? What do you think is the biggest challenge your team has in monitoring and managing these interns at the stage, this 2-to-1 ratio? What do you tend to see the major issues that seemingly percolate to the top?
One of the major issues that that we faced was it wasn't necessarily an issue through the summer months, but we were hoping to have a few of them hang on in the fall. And in the fall, all of these students were beginning their first semester in their respective accounting programs, which is usually the worst semester of the accounting programs. You're just very, very busy. And so we were struggling to get students who were willing to work a minimum, not a minimum, but 20 hours a week. And finding that if we left the flexibility for them to only work 10, there just wasn't enough momentum and enough continuity to make it worthwhile. So what we've done is, for those that work in the fall, it's unusual that we'll have somebody from that same summer cohort that then works with us in the fall. It's typically someone from the cohort before that then will come back and work with us in the fall, because they're further along in their program and they can actually manage 20 hours a week of work.
John Stoll, just curious, from your standpoint, being at Disney, with the size department being larger as well, have you attempted to do anything like this or similar to this from an internship program, and had any feedback on what works and doesn't work?
We have, although it's been on a very limited scale, and I would say I've also tried it at places that I was at prior to Disney. It really depends, I think, very much on what your model is like and how much insourcing that you do of a lot of your functions sometimes, as to making sure you've got that right pipeline. But I must say, in some areas, I've been very impressed with the quality of some of the interns that we've been able to get that have come through, and certainly something that when it works well and you're able to ultimately convert them into longer term prospects, it's something that's been very beneficial.
Has anybody attempted to bring interns on the technology side, IT interns, to look at what's going on in the tax functions and departments to get their perspective and see where they can find optimization opportunities? I'm just curious. So the next session, we're going to be doing a podcast on AI, robotics, and the implication to tax departments, but I was just wanting to see if anybody's taken that route. Scott, you included. Have you guys thought about or looked at anybody in that side of the fence?
I mean, it was interesting, some of the skill sets and not every single one of the interns, but we had a couple of the interns that, that was just something that they were highly effective at, and they were very interested in that area, and they were able to add a substantial amount of value to some of the work streams they were working on. In almost every case, these kids came in and said, well, gosh, what if we did something differently? What if we did it this way? We could possibly do it faster. And particularly in the first year, they assisted us, and there was a significant investment on our part in documenting very clearly what the process was, And that alone has actually helped us tremendously in our department. So the answer is yes. We had a few that were very tech savvy and brought some great skill sets to the table.
But nobody intentionally carving a role out just for that element within the internship pool, right? They just happen to bring that skill set.
I think in our case, the kids are a little bit young yet for that, and so that's why it was kind of a little hit or miss. I think that when you get into some that between their fourth and fifth year, or between their third and fourth year, that might be a little different. And I could actually see that happening given where we're headed from a technology perspective.
Okay.
Yeah, Tony, we have done that in tax technology before, and a more senior level person that was actually ended up converting to an analyst level within the tax technology area. But I must say, true to form, I think you're ahead of the curve in terms of this. I think this is going to be very much the emerging trend that we're going to see in the next year or two, and the value that some of these people can bring, particularly people that have historically not been viewed as tax people, in terms of their skill set, will be enormous.
We're in for some changes, aren't we, gentlemen and ladies? It's inevitable. Any other questions, Shannon, before we move on to the rest of the presentation?
Nope, I think that was it.
Excellent. Scott, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
My pleasure, Tony.
Please feel free to stay on if you want to listen in. Your prerogative. I know you.
I've actually got to run for another meeting or two, but I would say if there's anybody that wants to call me, feel free to give your group my contact information. Happy to have a one-on-one.
Excellent. Very appreciative of that. Thank you, Scott.
Okay, you're welcome. Bye-bye.
All right, so we will switch gears now to the topics of recruitment and development, and that will be covered by John Stoll, Tony Santiago, and Gareth Davies. John worked for many years. John Stoll, he leads the tax function at the Walt Disney Company, where he is responsible for global tax matters. And he worked for many years as a tax advisor for a Big Four firm, both in the U.S. and abroad, before switching to the corporate world in 2003, where he has held multiple positions as a regional counsel for Asia Pacific and Latin America, European Tax Council, Director of Tax Planning, and since 2005 as the U.S.-based head of tax. And he's been with Disney since 2013. Gareth Davies is actually transitioning into a new role. He will be the executive director for Tax Jobs, Tax Force, and TaxTalent. Tax Jobs is just to give you a quick snippet about each one. Tax Jobs is a niche tax employment solution that offers a targeted strategy to reach both passive and active job seekers. Tax Force is a high-touch service that matches highly vetted, well-seasoned tax professionals with specific tax projects that tax departments have. And TaxTalent is an online community specifically for tax professionals and tax students that really just lets them develop themselves in their career and also their leadership skills and also the people they lead as well in their department. So, Tony, I'll give it back to you just to recap the last 3 sessions.
Okay. Would you move the slide, Shannon, please?
Yep. There we go.
Okay, so we've had 3 prior sessions. Each of these sessions was designed to lay some groundwork. The first one was optimizing and assessing one's personal strengths and weaknesses in relationship to what the company's objectives are in the role as the chief tax officer. The second one was assessing the department and the personnel, what they brought to the table in relationship, again, to the objectives that the company had. And the third was to make sure we understood clearly what the KPIs and the measurements were going to be to determine what excellent performance would be. And now we lead into going back and looking at those things, looking at the leaders' strengths, looking at the department staff strengths and weaknesses, looking at what we're going to be measured by, and trying to assess whether or not there is a need to recruit. And if there is a need to recruit, that's one side of the fence. there is always a need to develop. So development in alignment with those KPIs and the skill sets that maybe we're a little weak on as the department and we need to beef up. Ideally, we try to develop first, of course. If we have to go to the outside to bring in talent to fill gaps, that's something we have to do, of course. Sometimes recruitment is not something we can proactively plan for. Sometimes it's reactive. So we'll take that into account in the presentation here as well. Before we start on actual recruitment, there's an element that John's going to cover here, which I think is very important, and that is effectively preparing before you go to market and making sure you have these ducks in a row. So I'm going to turn that over to John and let him take it away.
Thanks, Tony. Yeah, as Tony was saying that, I think one of the key initial steps with respect to this is really making sure that you're prepared for the recruiting process and you really properly define exactly what you're looking for. In a situation, particularly when you're a new leader, this is one of the areas that you're going to very much be judged on. It's going to help sort of shape the way that you're viewed as an executive leader, your ability to recruit and lead people. And certainly, you should do everything that you can in this stage to try and minimize the chance of a misstep. You will have situations, no matter how often people go through this, where you're going to sometimes end up with the wrong fit for a role, or just you may have something that's well beyond your control where you end up in a situation where the person really just doesn't end up being the right hire in hindsight. But nevertheless, I think you should acknowledge that that's the case. I would not get too distracted by the fact that you will have those instances, but very much focus on it. I like to think of it sort of like trying to improve your batting averages, because that is very much there are certain things that are going to be outside of your control in terms of being able to identify those right people. So I know that in the earlier sessions that you've looked at assessing the optimal state of the tax department, clarifying how you measure success within the department. I think the next real sort of question is how you're able to make these decisions around how you deploy your resources. And I think one of the critical aspects of this is really making sure that you get to the bottom line of understanding what is the actual underlying need here. What is the underlying business need? What do you need and why do you need it? Is it a temporary need or a permanent need? And then are there other sort of factors that are out there that could impact whether or not this is in fact a temporary need or not? So, for example, you could certainly in this environment we have the potential for tax reform, fundamental tax reform, significant changes that may have some impact as to what you need short term versus longer term. You also have the role of technology, where you are as on your journey around how you're going to use technology, but also where the tax department is relative to the rest of the enterprise with respect to its adoption of technology is going to be pretty critical there. And then also looking at things like the company's historic as well as future tax strategies and the impact that it'll have on your need for those resources. You may be inheriting a situation that's got a heavy caseload of audits that you're having to battle through, but as a result of a change in strategy, maybe that you focus more on different things. Or alternatively, you may have sort of buy off that the strategy that you want to adapt going forward is to be more dependent on rulings and advanced pricing agreements and things like that in order to get certainty in the tax function. And that would dictate sort of what types of resources and for how long you'll need those resources. So understanding that and understanding it in terms of in context with the broader direction and the objectives of the finance function is critically important. That can lead you to making some decisions that could be anywhere along what I sort of refer to as the continuum that goes from insourcing to full outsourcing. I think in this day and age, full outsourcing is pretty rare. And when I say full outsourcing, I mean there's always going to be a need to have to make sure that you've got internal resources that are appropriately supervising and measuring the success of the outsourcing relationship. But I think we're seeing more situations where there's either there's going to be some either full insourcing or a variation between a co-sourcing relationship with your advisory firms or technology, which is the other sort of important piece. And making sure that you've got the right people and the right resources that have the right skills to be able to conduct those relationships is highly critical to this broader process. In some instances, and when you're going through this, in some instances when you're evaluating these things, it may cause you to actually go back and have additional discussions with your CFO about the direction of the department and the need for resources where you see it. And it's always critically important that you're 100% aligned in terms of the direction you're going, so that you'll have full support in the way that you're building that. What you can find in many instances when you're looking at some of these temporary needs or in situations maybe where the underlying strategy has not yet been completely settled, there may very well be a case to be made for bridge staffing. And I've had instances before where I've worked successfully with Tony for some situations with bridge staffing, which in hindsight have been very effective. Some of the benefits that you get from bridge staffing is that you often get the ability to bring in someone sometimes who is a little bit more seasoned in the area, and especially if it's an area that you're not, that is not one of your specialties, that you're able to bring that person in and help you evaluate what is needed going forward and to build out something, but then realizing the fact that on a go forward basis, you're not going to need that more sort of senior level of resource. So, in the short term, there may be a sort of a cost associated with it, but I very much look at that cost as being sort of more of an investment in developing and confirming your strategy for the tax department. And, again, there are a number of instances when you're going to have some of these external factors that are out there that'll also drive the need for some form of bridge staffing. That will also, through using that type of relationship, it'll allow you to get into a position where you're able to really understand and confirm, sometimes based on their experiences at other companies as well, whether or not the strategy that you're developing is in fact likely to be the most successful for you. And so I would say over the long term, it's often the most economical because it certainly helps you minimize the chances of some of these missteps. I want to move on to the next slide. I've always maintained that hiring, actually your people decisions more generally, but certainly hiring is one of the most important decisions that you will make as a leader. And it's certainly one of the core components that people look to in terms of evaluating you and as a leader, as an executive generally. If you make a bad decision, that's, I think we all know that that's going to create a lot of incremental work down the road. So it's important that you invest the right amount of time once you bring these people on board to develop them to be potential leaders within your department or of your department in general. It is also critical when you're going through these decisions and evaluating what's needed to think about what impact that's going to have on your existing staff. So sometimes, it means you may very well have very highly valued staff, but they may feel like you may come to the conclusion that they're not just ready for a particular role that is being filled, and this will often, these decisions will often prompt those discussions. And I think, frankly, it gives you the opportunity to have a very candid and honest discussion with them about their development within the department, and frankly, how the new hire would be able to assist them with their development as a tax and business professional just generally. So there may also be instances sometimes where if you merely sort of indicate that you're going to post a position, that it may prompt members of your staff to take action, and you need to be prepared to adapt to that. It also may highlight, when you bring in a new leader, they may very well make evaluations of some of the staff in terms of whether or not they believe that their performance is up to scratch. And sometimes you have broader issues that you're dealing with in terms of bringing up a tax department to be a world-class organization. And when you're doing that, I'd very much sort of focus on building things up from the top, from a top-down approach. Certainly, to the extent you can, you want to be able to pick leaders within your organization that can be very much part of the hiring process and evaluation process of their own teams, as opposed to having a situation where you're building from the bottom up. When you have some of these external environmental issues, or also if you're in a situation where the company's financial situation is challenged, I think you have to be prepared to act fast when you've identified and made a decision as to where you want to move forward on that. And it does very much go to this key characteristic of a leader, of being able to act decisively. But it's always it's a sort of thing that you can't unring that bell once you've made that decision and hired someone. So it is always critical that as you're going through the actual recruitment process, which Tony will talk about next, that you really do your due diligence to make sure that you've got the right candidate to move forward and make that. It is ultimately a big investment that you're making in them and that they are making in your department in terms of building it out to be a world-class organization.
All right, we'll open the floor for any questions anyone has for John.
Hi, John. This is Risa Garrett. I have a question. It seems to come up very often, at least to me lately, about whether hiring is the right direction or outsourcing, or what is the right direction for the tax function. And I'm just wondering, what's your experience? I mean, how has that played into, let's say, your more recent decisions? Because to me, the landscape is changing.
Sure. So I think the way that you look at this ultimately is that you have to take into account the cost and effectiveness of your entire organization. And when I say entire organization, I don't view my organization as necessarily being limited to the people that report into me. I view my advisors in many respects as being part of my organization. I certainly view my contractors as being part of my organization. And I think in the very near future, I'm going to be viewing what I'll call the digital workforce as being part of my organization too. So when looking at the issue as to whether or not to sort of more fully outsource a function, I typically look at whether or not this is something that is a recurring need for the organization. If you have a one-time need or something that's highly specialized that you cannot economically replicate or maintain that resource during the year for a full year, then it would certainly lead you to suggest that going and hiring someone is not going to be your optimal strategy. In fact, you're better to co-source or outsource that particular function. So, just as simple examples, if we were to have a complex state tax audit in a particular state, I'm going to be best served by speaking to a local state tax attorney in that particular state that is fully aware of all the procedural aspects and all the other sort of things that you would need to know, and frankly sometimes that has the relationships with the Department of Revenue for a particular job. I would certainly hope that I'm not going to have a need for that person on a full-time basis. So that's probably an obvious example of where you would look to outsource or certainly co-source some sort of part of your function. Similarly, a question actually just came up relatively recently, and I think you always want to ask yourself this question. We had a situation where we were evaluating what we do for the research and development credit, and one of the people within our finance leadership team had asked me the question as to, well, do you foresee a situation where you would ever sort of completely in-source this function? We had historically worked with some of the accounting firms to assist us with that, and we found that it's a situation where you have a specialty need for a finite period of time. It's not economical for us to focus on that. There may be aspects of the data gathering process that we can certainly take on ourselves, and frankly rely on technology now to do. So I think there's always a role in terms of using your organization to make it more effective for whatever external partner you may have. But to me it was a clear situation for us, at least, where there just wasn't that ongoing need. The other area that you may sometimes benefit from having someone external sort of weigh in is where there is something that is largely sort of a commodity, where frankly you don't have the time or the resources to do the function cost efficiently, and you're better off to outsource something like that. So I think for all of the tax function areas, we have to constantly reevaluate those things and just say, doing this internally, are we better off doing it externally? Cost is clearly one of those big drivers for all of us. I think without exception, most companies, that's one of the biggest drivers around our effectiveness and efficiency as a function, is being able to identify those situations where we should outsource things. So it's really a case of trying to strike the right balance and managing that accordingly.
All right. Thanks very much.
I had a question come in on the chat. How do you factor in diversity in the recruitment process?
Yeah, I'm fortunate to be in a company where, diversity is always, very much promoted more broadly throughout the organization. And certainly when we go through the recruiting process itself, we partner with our internal HR organization. So in many respects, it kind of, any effort that we have involving recruiting, whether it's internal or external, is essentially kind of going through that filter. I think it's one of those things where it certainly always has been a very much a positive outcome in terms of making sure that is a key component of your decisions around building out your department. And when I think about diversity, it's not maybe just in the narrower traditional sense that people think about. I think it's always critical to have diversity in terms of like educational background and work experience and and sometimes industry experience as you're bringing people on. Some of the most successful tax people that I've worked with have got the most amazing educational backgrounds that had nothing to do with tax. It's almost an accident that they fell into it. And I've often found that your teams seem to be more effective when you've got that type of diversity, in addition to obviously the more traditional types of diversity. So it's a critical component.
John, this is Lisa again. May I ask, to follow up on the area of diversity, do you do anything within your organization to, right, so if those are your views and your approach, I grant you things usually, the tone is set at the top, but do you take any steps for your direct reports or people deeper in the organization to try to ensure that they employ the same approach?
So I would say that at my particular employer at the moment, the tone is set from the top, but the tone is pretty strong and pretty well understood through most of the organization. But that said, to your point, so I think that, for example, most of the hiring managers that are in my organization fully, are aligned and understand sort of the importance of diversity and our approach with respect to that. That said, I personally always like to have visibility in terms of the short list that we're looking at and the candidates that we're looking at within our organization. We have just under 100 people in our tax organization. And, even with that number of people, that's still manageable as a leader. Again, because I see the hiring process and the recruiting process as being one of the most important decisions that's made for the long-term benefit of the organization. So I see it as time well spent to make sure that we're getting the right people. And as part of that process, I certainly have visibility in terms of, how broadly we're casting the net. And, where appropriate, I'd be in a position to be able to raise the questions with respect to diversity. But frankly, given the fact that most of my hiring managers all fully sort of understand our approach around that, it's not generally been necessary for me to take any further actions.
Thanks.
John, this is Tony. A question for you on preparing to go to market when you have to recruit. What has been your experiences in trying to align the market's availability to the demands in your position? And before going to market, is there much work that you do to try to lay out to see if you're going to be in sync with the market from a compensation package and relative to the years of experience and the expertise you're looking for? It's one of the things I find a lot of the companies I deal with, they're just not prepared. They haven't done a little bit of that legwork beforehand, and then they have to go back to management, get special approval. I'm wondering, is there some element you do of that on the front end before you go to market so that there isn't having to come back and during the middle of a search and do that?
Yeah, I try to make sure that people fully understand, particularly if there are areas of high demand or shortage within the tax function, or areas where we've historically had problems in being able to quickly fill positions, and sometimes that's often location-based as well. And it's interesting when I say location-based. I've been in different organizations in different parts of the world, and sometimes you'd be surprised. There's some locations that people say, okay, that's a challenging location, but there's others where you think it would be a very attractive place, but part of the issue you're going to have is a very high cost place as well. So, for example, we have some of our team here in Los Angeles, and that's one of the big challenges that we have in the LA marketplace is the cost of living, or New York, whereas cost of living is a little bit more sort of reasonable in a place like Florida, and we have a significant team that's there, and that's that generally doesn't come up as a as much of a concern. But to your point, Tony, about sort of educating the people, one of the other issues that we sometimes run into is our internal comp team making sure that they have a full appreciation of the position and what's involved with respect to that. It's very frustrating, for example, when you're trying to hire, let's say, a manager in transfer pricing or tax accounting, and they have data that may be aggregating data that includes people that are, say, like, I don't know, a payroll tax manager or some, there's some sort of broader type of manager that's maybe more, it's typically at a sort of a lesser scale. So if the data is so aggregated, and again, it's not taking into account location differences and things like that, you can end up in a situation where you have a real challenge on your hands to get the right people. I felt like over time, we've invested I've personally invested a lot of time with our comp partners internally to help with the education process around that. At times, going back in different organizations, Tony and his organization have been very helpful in that regard, especially when, there are situations too where, the whole issue of benchmarking positions comes up and you're able to help educate your comp people about, some of your existing positions, and I think that helps when it goes to fill new positions that come out. By the way, with respect to the benchmarking piece of it, I see that as a very critical piece of managing your department overall, because given all the effort that will go into in terms of recruiting and then developing the people once you have them, the very last thing that you want to see is a situation where someone is leaving because their compensation is well below market, or there's an issue around compensation that couldn't otherwise have been addressed with appropriate education within the organization and awareness of what's going on in the marketplace. And, again, that's one of the issues that you have in being in a specialty organization or a specialty function within an organization, is that there may not be that sort of awareness just as to what is going on in the external market. And it may be very easy, for example, for someone to look at broader functions within a finance or controllership organization and say, well, a manager is a manager is a manager. But we all know that even within tax, the market, the external market that you may have for various specialty functions and generalists may be wildly different. So it's one of those things that you just have to keep battling on, but it's really important that you can do everything you can to educate people in that regard, because it's the most frustrating thing when you've identified the right candidate and then compensation's the sticking point, and then you have to go back to square one. So, and Tony, you've probably, see a lot more of that than I do in terms of how people, how often that comes up and how people deal with it. But I must say, given the investment that you make in that, you just want to make sure that you've scoped that out correctly at the beginning. It also may mean that you're not going to end up casting your net wide enough to attract the high quality talent that you'd otherwise want, because if you've scoped it out at the wrong range initially, it's something they're not interested in. And, it's much better to really nail down that open item right at the beginning.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's when I get searches that have been out there for 6, 12 months, 18 months and not filled by other organizations or their internal HR group, usually I'd say the majority of the time it's because they weren't in sync with the market. No one had reconciled the differences between what they were asking for versus what was available in relationship to what they had to offer. So you just have to come back in, get the data, hard facts, not opinions, bring it to the client, and they can adjust in a couple of ways. They can raise their compensation, they can lower their requirements to align it with the market. And then lo and behold, in 3 months, the 2 months, the searches are filled and everything is moving forward. But if there's one thing I will stress on the preparation is make sure you do your due diligence, get people who know what the market is, get the comp numbers out there, don't guess, and have it in alignment. It will save you so much headaches later on, and it will make you look better from a leadership standpoint that you're not out there floundering. And the longer those jobs stay open, John and I know, the more likely they get pulled. So that's a whole nother discussion point, but yeah.
Well, and also the harder they become to fill too. It's, I guess, no different than selling a house, right? If your house has been on the market for 6 months, people think, oh, there must be a problem with that, right? So
yeah, it gets stale right away.
Yeah.
Do we have any more questions from the group before we move on? All right, Tony, I will hand it off to you to talk about recruitment.
Okay, so basically the first thing I try to tell people is think about where the role is coming from. Is it newly created? Is it an existing role? If it is an existing role, are we looking to replicate the person and the type of role it was before, or are we taking a step back and looking at that saying, should we reassess how we're going to use this head count? Number one, do we still need it? You know, I'll even come with my clients and they're expecting me to be, you know, yes, we got to fill a job. And I say, first off, is this really a needed role? And assuming it is it constructed in the manner that's best for where we are right now, based upon where the KPIs are, where we're being measured, based upon where the gaps you have in the other, you know, staff members you have, going back to our session 1, 2, and 3 again. So we're going to look at that and make sure that these are positioned properly. Sometimes you want to upgrade a role. Sometimes we decide we should downgrade the role. You know, we might reassess the type of technical skills we need. If it's a replacement, same thing. We still go and look at the same set of circumstances we just talked about for a new existing role. If we're creating a role, we kind of done that already, right? We've already looked at that and built it the way we want it. So if you get into numbers 2 and 3, an existing role that you're replacing that's there, and you got to replace that person, sometimes it's internal, sometimes it's external. Just make sure you're taking a step back and making sure it's in alignment with what you really need then. The next thing to do is to put these in 2 buckets. Is this position a critical role or not? The 80-20 rule is kind of what I use. I tell people, is this one of these 20%ers that produces 80% of the value for the department? All openings in a department are not equal. Some of them are to the point like John indicated, they're somewhat commoditized and maybe can be outsourced or insourced type of program. But if it is a critical role, those you really need to spend more time on in the preparation side. Those you don't shortcut. I would suggest you not to shortcut any of them, but put that other bucket role, that one that's really important and critical. I've got a client right now, they're spinning off 2 entities. The management in its wisdom is saying that we're going to spin these off. They announced it a month and a half ago, 2 months ago. They want them closed either in December or March, really short time frames. And it was a messy situation. They've got 2 hires in the tax accounting reporting area. It's the 4th quarter. Recruiting at this time is devastating because how many people are going to leave right before year end and walk away from their companies? And if they do, you got to question them. So we have to really think through that kind of staffing model there on the prep side and say, okay, guys, is this practical to do that? Or should we use bridge staffing to get you over the hump and then go to market and have somebody starting after the first of the year and they get through year end close? So if it's a critical role, I spend a lot more time and you should really analyzing whether or not it's a realistic search at that point. The recruiting methods also play to this. If it's a critical role, in most cases, I tell my clients whether they use us or not, I don't care. They got to use whoever they're confident with, but a third-party outside firm to assist them on it is pretty much a no-brainer. If it's not critical, then we can go in other avenues with internal resources, and then there are also new alternatives like our target hiring campaign and things like that that we do under tax jobs that are much more cost-effective. So it's a budget issue. Do we want to spend the money to outsource it to a third-party firm? You don't need to all the time. And sometimes you might not even need to on a critical role if, in fact, we've got some hooks in the line and maybe there's some referrals internally that we think might play out and we're not worried about timing. So, you know, we can play those out, and if they work, great. If they don't work, we can still get back in the market. if they're critical and they have a short time fuse, those two factors together almost make it that you got to cash your chips in and get help with a third-party firm if at all possible. Timing's another major issue into that, besides the critical nature of the role. If you can, obviously internal resources makes everybody happy. You have an HR department, you should use them to their fullest, before even entertaining going to a third-party company. Sometimes you don't have any options in certain positions, certain companies, certain times. I know, Steve Caravello's down in the oil patch with us today, and the budgets there are tight. Let's face the facts. And no different than it was in financial services when we went through the last economic downturn in 08, 09 in the New York market. These things happen, and you then have to deal with what you have to work with, whether it's critical or not. So keep in mind internal resources are there. If you're going to outside firms, make sure you understand the difference between a retained firm and a contingency firm. This is basic stuff to me, but that's like saying, you guys telling me the new APA regs are basic to you. They're not to me. So a retained firm is paid an upfront amount. It's usually paid over a breakdown of a third, and a third, and a search. So they're protected. They work exclusively for you. They take the candidates to you only. They don't market them to other companies. They're not a broker. They are actually an extension of you, and they work on a retained level. Contingency firms don't usually charge much less. It's usually about the same overall cost, but they are a broker, and they market a candidate to you, and that candidate they could also be taking to other companies. So a lot of HR groups just knee-jerk react to contingency, especially if they're not at the executive level. I don't know why they do that, because the costs come out about the same. And quite frankly, as a broker, and I was a contingency firm many years ago, I got out of it, moved into retained. The problem is your alliance, your allegiance is to yourself, not even to the candidate or to the company. You're there to get a fee to pay for your overhead costs, and you're paid on performance only. There's no guarantee of money coming in. So I always recommend my clients, I said there are some good contingency firms out there, don't get me wrong, but most of the time they don't really work on your behalf, and you need to know that, and they could be taking that candidate to another company, and you could have a bidding war on the candidate right before your eyes. Retained firms should be working for both you and the candidate. They should. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Be looking at the needs and wants of both parties and making sure they're in alignment and protecting both parties, both the candidate and the employer, which of course protects the employer in the long run. Internal resources, these guys in HR have gotten all tickly pink about, first job boards, and then it was outside sourcing companies, and then it was LinkedIn that they can recruit from. Internal referrals, external referrals, all of those can be used. The job board market has kind of dried up. The effectiveness of it is kind of diminished. It's kind of like white noise out there. Too many people getting hit with jobs. There's nobody getting a chance to get their questions answered. So if I called any of you up on this phone and I talked to you about a great job, and after you said, look, I wouldn't mind hearing more about it, the next thing I told you is, well, you got to go fill out an application, put a resume together, come back, talk to somebody in HR. And then after all that, maybe I'll answer any of your questions that are related to this particular position about how tax is viewed, what the number of returns we have, what's the, ETR rate, and what are we trying to drive it down to. None of that gets addressed in that internal process. That's where it falls apart. The average application, this is a true stat, it sounds astonishing, but the average application that comes from a job board to a hire is a ratio of 1 out of 150. You have to have 150 applications to fill one job. And what I have seen is most of my clients just end up getting worn down. They're worried about losing the job, so they settle. And then later on, they don't have good managers coming up the ranks, because when they were hiring staff and seniors, they settled. And now they got to go and use me to do a retained search for a manager. I have 3 retained searches going on for managers. We just filled 2, and I have 3 more, which is unheard of. But they're looking at their internal staffs going, we just don't have the A players in there coming up the ranks. We're going to have to go from the outside. Now, that shouldn't happen, but it's happening because we're falling down on our recruitment efforts at that level. The external referrals are good. Advisors, everything else. Just remember, public accounting firms, law firms want to put the friends of the firm in there. They want to put people in there who will keep their billings up at those firms or get their foot in the door there. It doesn't mean they're not good candidates, but understand there's not an objective analysis going on. There's a biased position there going on. And I have just been astonished by how much they don't understand what my clients needs when they refer somebody to me. You know, refer somebody to me and I go, look, I got a turnaround situation and this guy is no way going to do the turnaround. Yeah, but he's a good guy. He knows this technical area and this. I said, yeah, but he's not going to be able to take and drive the turnaround. So what's the point? Well, I just thought you'd want to know about him. Okay, I appreciate it. Now, if you know anybody on turnaround, I want to hear about him. But, you know, they're usually pitching somebody's in transition and trying to get a friend of the firm in. There are going to be new alternatives, you know, just like there's new things coming up and John's hinting at it and everybody knows it's coming. The AI robotics podcast we're going to do for the next session, we'll really get into the meat of that. But everything, technology is hitting everything. And there's technology in the staffing business that's hitting us as well. LinkedIn was one of those things. The problem with LinkedIn is, again, same model. You don't get your questions answered. You can reach out and send an email to these people and all this, but they're getting inundated by everybody, and nobody is engaging with them to answer their questions unless it's a third-party staffing company. Half the time, they don't even know what they're talking about in tax. So that even makes these people more resistant to that model. So we're one example. There's going to be many others. So I'm not telling you this is it, but it's coming. Alternatives to the market. We use the technology of being able to target, hyper-target candidates in our target hiring campaign. And what we do is we set our clients up so that they will answer these candidates' questions. The fear factor is you're going to get 50 responses, but you don't with this model because technology can zero in. We have that ability. We've built the databases over 100,000 tax professionals. We can sort them by academics, subspecialties in tax. You know, if you want a 5471 guru, technology platforms, OneSource, CorpTech, Vertex, it doesn't matter. Whether they're heavy in planning, whether they're heavy in transactional planning, whether they actually have language skills, you name it, we can sub-target them. So we had one client, and he called me up, and he wanted to give me a retainer, and he'd been struggling for a manager, and it really was a pretty attractive job, about a $2 billion company. He was a pretty competent international planning person himself, but he was the head of tax, and he needed to find a manager. He'd been looking. He was on the West Coast. Obviously, as you know, John indicated, the costs are high there. But it was a really good opportunity to get some great work and mentor under this person. We set him up with the target hiring campaign. He ended up having to speak to, I believe, 5 or 6 people to answer some questions. And he ended up with 2 great candidates. You know, the candidate that came in second was a Duke JD grad with some really impressive credentials from a major law firm that he couldn't believe he would get in that model. That model's been more successful than ever dreamed it would be. We've got it at 2 years now. We filled 90%, right at 90, I think it's 88% change of the jobs we were given, and we only get the hard ones. We're filled in 90 days or less. So that's amazing for that level there. So there's going to be other new technologies. Make sure your eyes and ears are open to them. They're going to help you. Next screen, Shannon. I talked about the core principles of recruitment, whether we're in the middle or you're doing it yourself. But this is something I see people missing, and I call it my 4 boxes. Did this about 30 years ago. Assessing the candidate's needs and wants. When you do get to engage with these candidates, either a representative of you, if your HR department's competent enough to do this, great. You can send the screen to them and I'll train them for you if you need them. I don't care. But you guys can take the lead on this, or your team can, or your department heads or leaders can. Find out what is most important to a candidate, and a need is non-negotiable. So when I'm breaking a candidate down and doing the vetting process after they've applied and I get to have my chance to answer their questions, I want to know what's motivating them to make the move. What are they looking for out of an opportunity? What are their long-term goals? What are they trying to achieve? Is this somebody who wants to be a head of tax and someday replace me if I'm the chief tax officer? Is this somebody who wants to run the tax ops area? It's very important in the interviewing process to start this process. A little bit later, Garrett's going to carry this over into the development of your own internal staff. This has got a lot of power to it, so this is something you guys really should pay attention to. Each candidate has needs that are absolute, non-negotiable. Then they've got wants. The ones you're worried about are the top 1, 2, or 3. Do not worry about the other ones, but really hone in on the number 1, 2, and 3. So when I ask a candidate, what is something that's important to you that wouldn't necessarily have to be here, but you would like to see? It would be a plus. And what would those things be? And it gives me those things. So in what order would you have those? What would be the most important out of the first 2 or 3 if they gave me 4 or 5? If they gave me 3, can you put them in the order of importance? Very important now. It also is important when you get down to negotiating with the candidate to know where their real hot buttons are. And it's absolutely important as you manage them and develop them going onboarding after you hire them. The circle of influence is the people that they might bounce things off of professionally And then we'll talk about personally here in a minute. Professionally, it's their mentor. Are they close to their boss? Do they have a mentor? Is it a professor they used to work with? Who are the people they bounce things off of professionally? It's not a bad question to ask. And also asking that a third-party question. So if they say, look, I really am close to the guy that I used to be reporting to at my prior employer. Do you know John? Yeah, I know John. Great guy. Okay, wonderful. You know, how would John describe you? If I was talking to John, and I won't call him, of course, without your permission, but if I was talking to him, what would he tell me are your strengths, the things you do really well? And what areas would he probably say, these would be great areas to add to and nurture and build on? You can use these questions to fragment and get a better perspective on the candidate directly. Those needs, those wants, essential. If you notice, we also have below that candidates, what they have to offer. The good news in tax, guys, is you guys don't tend to oversell yourselves. It's why I'm not a recruiter in sales and marketing. I probably have to put a bullet to my head with people like that. You guys are brutally honest and candid, and if anything, you're overly humble sometimes. But when I do talk to candidates about where their strengths are and what the things they really love to do and the things that they think they really excel at, they're usually pretty honest. Now, so I'm pulling that data out, and I understand what the candidate's needs and wants. I understand what the candidate can bring to the table. Now we go back to what John was talking about in prep. What you guys need to do before you go to the market is build these two boxes on the right, these circles. You need to have the company's needs and wants. So what are you guys looking for in this position? What do you need in this position? That's non-negotiable. And what do you want, and what are the most important wants? Because you're not going to get everything. And the candidate's not going to get everything either. You also better deal with the circle of influence. And in your case, that's going to be maybe your boss, maybe HR, maybe a key person in the department. John hinted about that. You better talk about how this hire is going to impact some of the people in the group. You might want their input because of that while you're designing the job's candidate profile. But we're going to do the same exact thing on the company side. And we're also going to do the same thing with what we can offer. This is where you got to get in sync with comp and HR. Upward mobility, advancement, what's realistic, what's not, and all the people that need to be involved in that, the compensation group, HR, maybe your boss, maybe a key person in the group, need to be involved in that decision-making before you go to market. Those two circles on the right are part of your prep time, has to be done before. Each candidate, you take them through the assessment on the left, and then you play God and match them up. You determine if the candidate's needs and wants will be in sync with what you have to offer. Can we meet their needs and wants? Same thing. Can the candidate, what they have to offer, meet our needs and wants? This thing's very powerful. Don't underestimate. If you do it right, your searches go smooth. So that's it on that topic. Next screen. Okay, once you go to market here, in part of the preparation is this consistent message. That's on the right-hand side, those two circles, making sure we know exactly what we need and what we would like to have in this position. And of course, it's important to know what we can offer to attract this person. When I'm breaking down a client, I cover three things. I want to know the job responsibilities and percentages in year 1, 2, and 3. I want to see if the job's going to evolve differently in year 1, 2, and 3. I will also, in that group of data, I want to know the deliverables. And the deliverables are, if you were going to give the candidate an outstanding evaluation in year 1, 2, and 3, what would they have done, accomplished to justify you giving that evaluation? Because I want to find people who I believe and they believe can achieve those deliverables and force you to give them that outstanding evaluation. That's what both our goals are from the candidate's point of view and yours as a hiring authority. Then I want to make sure that the candidate profile that we develop, when you're sitting down in preparation of the search, we will look at that candidate profile, make sure it's in sync with the actual responsibilities and the deliverables. Are we over-hiring or under-hiring? Does it make sense that we're looking for an attorney with a JD LLM from a top 5 school, yet we're asking them to do work that doesn't really make any sense for them doing? Why do we want that? Why would we create that disconnect? If they are in sync, we then move to the last step in this 3-step analysis with employers, which is what they have to offer. Goes back to that offer section on that right-hand side of those 4 boxes. And that includes compensation, upward mobility, culture, work hours, development, mentoring, the whole package, that you're bringing to the table there. And it also will entail looking at the location, what we can offer realistically and what we can't. Maybe it's an expensive place to live, you know, Southern California, but it's a beautiful place to live. Maybe it's not as expensive to live in, you know, Murfreesboro, Tennessee, but it's not everybody's cup of tea. So, you know, what does it offer out there? Maybe I better find somebody who likes the outdoors, hunts, that kind of stuff, and try to target that. So this preparation is essential, and the messaging needs to be consistent. All of the interviewers need to be prepped as to what we believe we realistically can offer and what our needs are versus our wants. I cannot tell you how many times when I get the group of interviewers together and I ask them, all of a sudden they're disagreeing on the basic needs we thought everybody was in agreement with before. Well, you know, one person, they've got to have the one source. The other person, no, if they've got corp tax or something else, that's good enough. No, guys, we got to come to, can I find people with it or not without it? I need to know. And that's very important to do early on there because it's going to be part of your interviewing process. Hyper-targeting of candidates is essential so you don't put your message all over the place. I talked about what we do on our internal side. You know, you don't want to post your ad on Craigslist, okay? It's going to drive you guys all nuts with wasting your time with unqualified candidates. Be prepared to answer the hiring process, to answer the candidate's key questions before asking them or her to go through their application process. So once again, we want to give them a chance to get their questions answered. Even when you're interviewing them, even when you're trying to vet them out, try to get them to show their cards first. You can tell a lot about the quality of the questions the candidate brings to the table. If their questions are more HR-related questions, you probably got the wrong candidate. How much is the pay? What's the how many hours do I work? You know, what's the benefits like? Instead of tell me what the measurement of success is going to be here. Why is this position open? Why was it created? Why did the prior person leave? You know, what are our major objectives? What will I be measured or evaluated by in year, you know, into 12th month of this project or this position? During the interview phase, it's important to understand what the candidate's needs and wants are before you communicate your needs and wants. Why is that? It's like a poker game. If I can get John Stoll to show me his cards and we're going to play all night, I'm going to break them. The odds are in my favor. We don't want them feeding into us what they think we want. So hold back what you need as much as possible and get their needs and wants. So you answer their questions, but don't give them everything. Give them enough. Say, look, you know, at the end of the day, it's going to be important we find people in this role that, you know, can do this, this, and this, but I'm not going to go into hyper detail. I'm going to hold back that. And then once I get some of their questions enough answered, I can flip it around and say, well, tell me about what you're really looking for, though, Bob. What is it that you're wanting? What's most important to you? What's motivating you to even think about taking a look at leaving such and such company? All through the process, let them know there is no winner and loser in this. You must paint the picture that everybody wins or we all lose. Therefore, let's be brutally honest and candid with each other. Transparency is a good thing in the interview process. Nobody wants to find out something's different than it was or is 6 months later. So getting that out to them and putting it on the table is very important. So transparency, making sure that we're all putting things on the table. Do not let the candidate that you're most excited about or the top 2 candidates or 3 go without being touched. If you're doing it internally, you don't have a third-party company, you got to do it yourself. Do not count on HR to do it. Either you or somebody on your team should stay close to those candidates. Whoever they're going to work with report directly, they should be the person staying the closest to them. And if it is a job below you guys, never underestimate how important you are to helping close that deal. You putting a call in here or there, you asking them about the personal side and making sure everything's good there. You showing interest in those candidates as the head of tax can do more good than anything else. That sends a message of value and importance that's there. It will also be helpful you at counteroffer stage when you got more hooks into these people. There's nothing wrong with asking a candidate if they're looking at other situations and how do you guys stack up. You might as well find out and hear it rather than hide from it. HR usually is not good at this. They run from it. Counteroffers, they're terrible at that too normally. They don't even prep candidates for it, but you will have to. If they're a really good candidate and it's a critical hire because it's a critical need, it's probably critical for the company they're leaving. Whether they have other situations they're looking at or not, you can fully expect them to get a counteroffer. you need to find out how much at risk you are. If the first thing they told you their need was they feel like they're underpaid, then the next thing you should tell them is, well, what if your company just paid you more money? Would you stay, or is there any other reason to leave? Because guess what? When you make them the offer, the company's going to offer them more money. So you've got to be prepared for that. This is a little bit of a crash course for you guys. This is what we do for our clients. But when you can't hire us, which won't happen all the time, of course, you've got to have some competencies in these areas, and your team does as well. The department heads underneath you. Next up, Shannon, we're going to go to questions. All right, I've covered a lot. I didn't cover everything, but I do want to get some questions in before we turn it over to Gareth, because development is essential. It will be your insurance blanket that you have less turnover. So we'll talk about that in a minute. But Q&As on recruitment going to the market.
I have a question in chat, Tony.
Yep.
How do you decide between an A+ person who doesn't quite have enough experience versus the B person that has the right experience?
So each client has to sometimes make these decisions. Sometimes we got a really good person who can hit the ground running, do the role that we need done. It's kind of like draft time at the NBA or the NFL. Do I go for the best athlete in this situation, or do I go for the person that is, quite frankly, competent enough to do the role, but I'm uncomfortable that the Peter principle won't hit in one more level or two more levels, and I have to deal with that as well. So you don't always need everybody to be an A player, but some departments I've worked with have had that attitude, and they're happy that they have what they call healthy turnover later on. We might not hold on to that person for 10 years. They might in 3, 4, 5 years, quite frankly, outgrow the department. So I have a big spiel about, people who outgrow departments, and sometimes departments outgrow people. And then sometimes things just change. We're going to have major tax reform. It looks like to a certain degree. How that's going to impact the kind of people, John hinted at it earlier, and the makeup of what we need might change. It certainly did in 1986. I was in the middle of it. And certain people we just didn't need anymore. And then we needed a lot of people that we just didn't have, and we had to go find them and add them to departments and grow them as quick as we could. And after we grew them, somebody stole them from us. So this guy's a foreign tax credit guru now. They got 2 years of experience. Well, they know more than the partner at the big four firm does. And all of a sudden you lose them. So keep in mind that, you know when you have an A+ player, guys. Everybody knows it. They're quick. They ask the right questions. It isn't necessarily they all went to the best schools or anything, but they know how to ask the right questions. The first thing about A players is they ask great questions. They also know how to answer questions very effectively. They don't go on and on and on. They don't ramble. They're able to take complex things and make them simple and stay on point. They don't go off into the Netherlands when they're answering a question. But do you need an A player or a B player? That's a different question. In each company, you have to make that assessment. Hopefully, at the time you're building the candidate profile on step number 2 out of my 3-step process I talked about. Job responsibilities deliverable number 1, candidate profile number 2, and that's where you would decide whether an A player is a need or just a preferred want, or a B player is the need or just a preferred want. Justin, I wanted you to kind of just speak to what you went through, being a new CTO for the first time and having to do quite a bit of staffing right at the beginning of your transition into the new role. Can you give us some sense as to what you went through and some of what you learned out of that would help the rest of us?
Sure. When I took over as CTO, I had a situation to where out of 4 direct reports, there was only 1. And there was an opportunity to consider very fundamental restructuring of the department, and I didn't know folks, so I had to go through an accelerated version of getting to know the existing team, identifying things that they did well and things that they did not do well, figuring on capacities, and then also right-sizing the department to the company. And while it was difficult, I think it was a great opportunity to build a lot of bridges with folks, and also to demonstrate right off the bat a capacity to identify talent and hire in a good team, being cost conscious and matching needs to the company. So while it was difficult, I think it was a really good opportunity. to go to that question that was just asked, I think we ended up doing a balance of looking for A, players that maybe didn't have the specific experience to the extent that might have been ideal, but they have an opportunity to grow into their position. And then we mixed that as well with people who were close to or at sort of the apex of their careers, but were very good at what they did and wanted to continue to do it. And balancing those two things with for us, culture is extremely important, and getting the right mindset and getting a team of collegial folks and people who are like-minded in their approach to work, which was also great. I still have 2 open positions, one of which has been a very difficult one to fill in Switzerland, where I've actually hired 2 people, and both those people were promoted out. Tony talking about the counteroffer stage of things. I lost on both of those battles. I'm about to offer the job to a 3rd candidate right now. So I don't know, Tony, is there anything else specific about my story that you'd like for me to touch on, or is that a pretty good overview?
That was a good overview. One of the things, Steve, I think Justin, that you did there that was interesting. Justin gave up a senior role that he could have filled, and instead chose, after evaluating his internal team, to take 2 people and promote them up into roles and allow them to grow into, and lost a little bit in the head count of as far as level of position. But I think, obviously from a morale standpoint, and a sense of commitment to development, which again, Garrett's going to go into next. I think that was a really smart move to lay the groundwork for the department there.
Yeah, it was very good. Ensuring, I think in some circumstances, continuity can be overrated, but for us, we have a relatively small department, and I was fortunate in that I had 2 people that were kind of at a one rung below direct report level who were very instrumental in how the department operated, had very good attitudes and great capacity. And so by promoting them, I think it did send a really good message to the department, and then also gives them an opportunity to grow. And for me, it allowed me to shift resources a bit also, so that I took away some of the heavy hitting under tax accounting and compliance and added more to the planning aspect of things. And so that was kind of the underlying strategic benefit to me, was rather than being really heavy on accounting and compliance, which we're still, I think, fully competent in, I was able to reduce that expertise and add more to the planning transactional function.
Excellent. Shannon, are there any other questions right now?
Nope, no more in the chat. Does anyone have any questions they want to bring up before we move on to Gareth?
Well, I'm going to make a suggestion here. We're a little running over, correct, Shannon?
Yes. Yep, we are over.
So we're over our time and I don't really want to push everybody's schedule, because we said we keep it to 75 minutes. We're a little bit over now. I don't want to shortchange development. I'm a recruiter. You think my biggest emphasis would be on recruitment, right? But it's not. I want you guys to retain people and have healthy retention in all your departments, and not have to go to market unnecessarily, as John talked about before. So I want to pull this one over to the next session and have development and retention together, which makes logical sense anyway, and not ask you guys to cash more chips in with extra time at this stage. So we'll pull it into the next session there and give it its just due, because it is something I think that's essential. If you can develop strategies for development, and it will end with phenomenal retention, and equally important, it will make your recruitment easier, because you will have an employer brand, as Justin is building in his situation, where people are going to die to want to work for him. John has done that through his career. I know that, having worked with him in 3 different organizations. It is very easy to recruit for people who have a great reputation. This development section is essential to that. So, Gareth, I apologize. I'm going to punt on this to the next session and let everybody wrap up here. Shannon, would you just let us know what's coming up on the next sessions then, and when you think we might have that scheduled? Yep.
So our next session, like Tony just said, will cover retention and now development, and also your staffing budget optimization. And that will likely be, excuse me, in mid-November, but within the next couple of weeks, we will send out the meeting invite, as well as information on who the speakers will be. We also want to let you guys know that, like Tony said, we are hosting a webinar that will cover artificial intelligence and how that will affect tax departments, and that is November 7th. And we have a really good group of presenters for that. We have Sharda Sharu that will be joining us. She's the America's Tax Intelligent Automation and Robotics Process Automation Leader at Ernst & Young. We have Tim McDonald as well, who's the VP of Finance and Accounting and Global Taxes at Procter & Gamble, and then Al Bradley, who's the president at Association for Computers and Taxation, along with Tony Santiago, of course. So we'll make sure that you guys, get first dibs on the seats for that, but we'll have plenty of seats for the webinar. So even if you can't make it, we'll make sure you all get the recording before the next Symposia webinar.
And I want to thank John especially. I know he's got a huge schedule right now, and he took out time to do this and pay back to the profession. So when John was a young buck coming up the ranks, he got mentored by a few people who were key to his development. And I know this is special to him as well, that you guys, as you're going through your development and growth, that you have access to people like this. We'll put John's accessibility on the speaker section of the site for you, along with Scott. So if you have follow-up questions or things you want to go over directly with them, do not hesitate to do so. I know they'll all be willing to work with you and help out. Thank you again, John.
Yep, thank you, John.
All right, everybody, we'll wrap up on this one. You take care. Everybody use the forum if on follow-up questions, and we'll be there monitoring to make sure you get your answers. Thanks again, and thank you, Shannon.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.